right, so thank you so much for joining me, Annie. Girls in Afghanistan protest for going back to school. At the same time, Taliban adding new restriction on women not being able to travel without a male company. In what is so Taliban are increasing all these measures on Afghan women, especially, and but they know that they are under sanctions and they are trying to remove the sanctions. Why they are so much not upholding the commitments that they are supposed to allow girls to go back to school?
I think it's very difficult for many of us to understand any of these rules, and particularly why the Taliban is choosing to even increase pressure at a point where, as you say, they are trying to negotiate with the international community. You know, they're under sanctions for something very separate. They are under sanctions for their links to terrorism, and those links are continuing. And I almost wonder if they are distracting attention away from the issues of terrorism, which they not only are not controlling, but in fact, they are increasing their ties, it seems, with Al-Qaeda over time. And that's something that the world also cares about. But instead, what we are seeing is them increasing pressure on women, which is also a terrible violation of their international human rights commitments.
Thomas West in Doha forum, he was talking. He said that he's hoping the Taliban will allow the girls back to school because they're lacking any kind of commitment to the U.S. and the world. So, do you think the Taliban are taking these kind of warnings serious?
At this point, they have not appeared to take any of these warnings seriously. I think they are perhaps considering this a negotiation where girls and women are negotiating, pieces for them in a bigger game. And I'll repeat, the sanctions on the Taliban are not actually about their violation of human rights. The sanctions exist because they continue to pose a terrorism threat in Afghanistan and in the region. So they will, I hope, get nowhere in the idea of getting sanctions lifted if, they suddenly reverse their stand on girls and women. That's not enough to lift sanctions. Sanctions are there for a different reason. They must comply with their international human rights obligations.
So I spoke to Rina Amiri. She told VOA that there are many options for adding more measures and sanctions against the Taliban, and some of the US lawmakers already still thinking about it. How likely it is, and do you think that will really help if the Taliban will understand that this is a serious issue that they're dealing with?
Well, I think if sanctions are imposed further, they should be in line with the United Nations resolution that imposes sanctions in the first place. And one such sanction that should be reimposed, in my opinion, is the travel ban on certain Taliban leaders. That doesn't hurt Afghans to reimpose that sanction. That's not something that hurts the Afghan economy. But I do think that Taliban leaders should not be allowed to travel around the world unless it is for the purpose of peace, which, at this point, it doesn't seem to be. And other measures should be taken that ideally will only target those individuals who are making these decisions. But sanctions in the United Nations context relate to the Taliban's embrace of terrorism as a tactic and their continued affiliation with terrorist groups.
So Taliban continue with the human rights abuses, including crackdown on media, and somehow they fear the media. And how do you see this crackdown on freedom of speech? And if there's no media, how people really can build trust for this government or their leadership?
I think it's a playbook of cracking down on the media that tyrants all over the world are using. And if the Taliban truly wants legitimacy with the Afghan people, having a free media and not intimidating those who express criticism is the very, very first step. Without that, there is no hope of any kind of process of gaining legitimacy with the Afghan people.
Recently, the China foreign minister was in Kabul along with the Russian officials, and they were meeting with the Taliban. So China probably has economic interest. So what is it that Russia really wants from the Taliban?
It's an excellent question, and perhaps what Russia wants today is different than what it wanted 6 months ago. Right now, Russia is looking for allies in a world that is increasingly united against Russia for its actions in Ukraine. Overall, I know that Russia cares a lot about the stability of Central Asia, and they are hoping that the Taliban will be something of an ally in the fight against terrorism that affects them. But I do think that, Russia and China have been part of a consensus at the United Nations that a legitimate government is essential to stability in Afghanistan and the region. And legitimacy, as I said, comes through the observance of human rights.
Yes, somehow the Ukraine crisis impacted Afghanistan negatively, and a lot of attention is given to Ukraine. How do you see this kind of relationship, what you mentioned about Russia or Iran or China, going through in Afghanistan? What are you trying to really establish in Afghanistan?
I think it is in play right now. And what has changed with respect to Ukraine may be that there is less attention on Afghanistan and that region. But Russia and China will always care about Afghanistan. They will always care about its resources and its strategic position. And we should never fool ourselves about that. The United States, in my opinion, made a grave strategic error by abandoning Afghanistan to predatory neighbors. And right now, what we're seeing is countries in the region who are willing to do business with the Taliban almost despite whatever tyrannical rule that they impose on their people.
So Annie, let's talk about the U.S. Diplomatic relation with Afghanistan, and maybe some mistakes has been made, or there was miscalculation of expectation from the Taliban, starting with the Doha Agreement. How is it going through right now? How do you see, is it on the right path, the way they treat the Taliban?
The United States took actions over the last 2 years that have resulted in us having very, very few tools with which to negotiate. And those actions, for example, mean that we cannot talk about any kind of security response to what is happening, and we almost have no economic tools at our disposal. So if the U.S. has, they canceled one meeting with the Taliban, that's one of the few tools left at our disposal. But what we also have to work with is the issue of recognition. And hopefully a united international community will impose certain conditions on the Taliban of legitimacy before any kind of consideration of real recognition occurs.
Great. So what about the assets? Taliban are really after unfreeze of the assets. And I think it has to be condition-based, that they have to respect human rights and girls' rights, as the UN, also some of the Security Council members call on them to let the girls go back to school.
I do think that economic tools are the appropriate ones to use with respect to the human rights conditions that the world is expecting the Taliban to comply with. And that can include, if not direct access to Afghanistan's sovereign assets, which can only be accessed by a legitimate government, at least some kind of loosening of the restrictions on those assets to allow the private sector to, the engine of the private sector, to be able to carry more Afghans out of poverty.
Yeah, so last question. So again, for the U.S. relation with the Taliban, what do you think went very wrong, which caused all this crisis in Afghanistan? And people are now suffering and dying, and Taliban adding more restriction. They're showing really the real face, that they're claiming that we will start a new era in Afghanistan with the girls going back to school.
I think that would require understanding their mindset fully, and I wouldn't claim to do that. I know from the side of the international community that the strategic error was in pulling out troops without achieving any kind of true pathway to a negotiated settlement there. That was our last point of real leverage, and we took it away, and we didn't get anything in exchange. I think that error has a lot to do with the situation that Afghan people, girls, women, minorities, vulnerable populations find themselves in today.
You mentioned about the distracting the U.S. about the terrorists. So there is an increase of terrorist activities, and there about in the Afghanistan, and Central Command as well confirmed this. So why they don't take Taliban accountable for that? Because they were supposed to cooperate with the U.S. or maybe just avoid any kind of use of terrorist activities from Afghanistan.
Well, I think that the U.S. and the international community do hold them accountable, because that increase in terrorist activity, that embrace of terrorist tactics like creating a suicide bomber battalion, those are the reasons why the UN and the bilateral sanctions remain in place, because that's why they were imposed in the first place.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Annie, for your